If everybody is ready, we appreciate you being here tonight, those who weathered the afternoon and storm, and hopefully you're staying dry if you're at home tonight and staying safe. Lord knows we needed a rain. I know our flowers and grass are happy, rejoicing that they're getting this rain now, and I'm sure there's places around town and that depend upon the rain, and so thank God for that. And hopefully the places in our country that need rain will desperately get it, or that will get it over this week. We're going to go ahead and continue in our Bible study tonight. We're going to be in Acts chapter 12. If you want to find your way there, we're going to be looking into some verses there, kind of midway through. Over the last two lessons, if you can remember, we were talking about the church going through a transitional period, and that it was moving from the gospel being really Jewish-centric, focusing on the Jew, to now we're starting to see the gospel spread out to even other nationalities. So other people, other groups of people, specifically non-Jewish or Gentile people, are now not only getting the gospel preached to them, they're receiving it, and along with the gospel, they're receiving the Holy Spirit. So they're getting the Holy Spirit in essentially alongside of the Jewish people. So we're starting to see this transition take place. Now, in chapter 12, we learn about another transitional kind of period, and that is persecution once again kind of cranking up, or at least we're beginning to read about it again. I don't know if persecution ever really stopped. If you go back and you read between the lines in the first 11 chapters, or first 12 chapters, you will realize that persecution never really stopped in the church, but perhaps we've just kind of been talking about different storylines, and so we haven't seen it or referenced it specifically. But remember back in Acts chapter 8, when the first really surge or traumatic experience that the church faced as far as persecution happened, what was that event that took place that really kind of shook the church? Does anybody remember when it comes to persecution? It was Acts chapter 8. It caused the disciples to be scattered about right after it happened. Y'all remember?
Was that when they knew that they made Saul walk away?
No, it was a little bit before that. This was the Stephen stoning. Remember that? Stoning of Stephen. It was Acts chapter 8. So Acts chapter 8 tells us about Stephen being stoned, and once he was stoned, remember the disciples scattered about. They went to different areas, and we talked about last week, some of those disciples ended up going down into Cyrene and Cyprus and those areas there, which was the island off in the Mediterranean. And those were the ones that came back to Antioch and began preaching to the Gentile people, these Hellenists, and actually that were non-Jewish people who spoke the Greek language, and they ended up talking to them about the gospel and leading them to the Lord. So they came to know the Lord, and there was revival taking place in Antioch, and many people became believers. The church was growing. So all that was a result of those kind of disciples scattering about. And now, the ones that had left was everybody besides the apostles. The apostles remained. So you had the main apostles, Peter, James, John, Barnabas, these others that are there with them are all there, along with Luke. They're all there serving in Jerusalem, or kind of working in Jerusalem. Now, tonight we're going to learn that just because we focused on other areas, like we've been talking about the areas in the lower area like Caesarea, Tarsus, Joppa, and all these other areas we've been talking about, just because we've been focusing on, we've kind of been looking at these other areas in the book of Acts, doesn't mean that there still wasn't persecution happening in Jerusalem. It's just now when we get to chapter 12, we focus back in on what these guys were actually facing. Remember, Peter was still kind of coming and going and moving about, as he was being threatened and arrested from time to time. So now we're going to focus on what was happening back at Jerusalem where the apostles were. And we're going to get into it as we look at a guy by the name of Agrippa. You're going to see his name mentioned a few times in the New Testament, but here we have him in Acts chapter 12 in reference to what's going on. So let's look at it together, verses 1 through 4. It says, "Now about that time Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover." Now, a little bit about this Herod. Now, this is Herod Agrippa, okay? He is the grandson of Herod the Great. Now, y'all might remember Herod the Great was the one who, at the time of Jesus' birth, was wanting to put all the babies to death. He's the one that commanded all babies under the age of 2 and under, be put to death. So that's Herod the Great. This guy has a great family lineage, right? Just a great family tree to look up to. If you study the Herod Agrippa, we'll just call him Agrippa for tonight. If you study Agrippa, he was a basic loser, okay? He was pretty much a loser. He didn't come to power. He wasn't even the first choice in his family. Antipas was the first choice, which was his brother. He was the first choice to take the throne. And Agrippa found himself almost imprisoned at one time by his own government. And so he kind of finagled his way out. And one time he had to leave the whole country and kind of go out of town. And then he had to work his way back in. And he was kind of a conniver. He was somebody who had gotten in, thought he could buy his way into popularity, and eventually got himself in a bunch of debt, and he couldn't get himself out of it. And after nearly being imprisoned, he actually came back to town and borrowed a bunch of money from some friends and used that money to pay off his debtors. And so it's like borrowing money to pay off more debt, and you get in more debt to pay off more debt. And so he was not a very good guy, not a smart guy, but he connived and manipulated, and he got his way into the kingdom, and he became king. So I say all that to say that this was not an upstanding guy. He was not a guy who was trying to do the right thing. He was a guy who was all about himself, and he was all about trying to make himself look good. And so part of the reason why he had James killed was he thought, maybe this will get me some popularity with the people. You have to remember, James at that time was probably number 2 on the most wanted list among the Christians, okay? James was probably number 2. I'll give you all a guess who would be number 1. Peter would be number 1, okay? He'd be like on all the posters and all the post offices. He's number 1. They're wanting to get him locked up for sure. And so he has James killed. Now, I don't know whether it says by the sword. I don't think Agrippa did it himself. I'm sure he had an assassin or somebody do it for him, but he commanded it. He was the one who had it done and took the credit for it for sure. And then he proceeds to have Peter arrested, and he gets Peter locked up. Now it's during the time of leading up to Passover, so that week leading up to Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that's where they take all the leaven and get it out of their house, preparing for that. You get all that leaven out, so you get rid of the sin. And then it's that time of that we think of as being that time of Lent, where you're going to give up the good stuff, and you're going to look now looking toward Passover and the brokenness of that comes from remembering what that took place and how God delivered you from Egypt. That's all Passover was about. And so this was the time and the season that was taking place. And so Agrippa, not that he didn't want to, I don't think he was holding Peter so that he wouldn't disrupt the Jewish people from having their feast and such. More than likely, he was holding Peter as like having like a cherry on top type thing. You know, at the end of this Passover, he's going to come to them and say, "Hey guys, guess what? I got Peter for you. You know, here's what you got." And you know, it's sort of like, "Look at me. Look what I've done. You know, I'm this cool guy, and I'm your best. I'm the best king ever." And so that's kind of the reason why he's doing all of this. And so that's kind of where we find taking place there in the first part of Acts chapter 12. Now notice as we look at his imprisonment, let's take a little closer look at what's taking place here in verses 5 and 6. Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. And when Herod was about to bring him out, that night Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. I want you to notice there's a lot packed into these 2 verses. First of all, we know the church is praying for him, right? And we're going to get into that a little bit later. But the church is praying. And that's always a good thing. Because it should be that the first thing you do when you face adversity is go to God in prayer. That should be the first thing you do. It shouldn't be last resort. It should be the first thing we do anytime we face adversity. And by the way, anytime we're facing victory, we should be going to God in prayer as well. Shouldn't wait till we're just facing hard times. It should be all the time in prayer. And so actually, when you look at the language there, it says that they were in prayer, that they were continually in prayer. The idea is that they were praying without ceasing. They were nonstop praying for Peter's deliverance, for Peter's help, for Peter's protection. So that's what they're doing. Now, notice what's going on with Peter. While the church is praying, Peter is locked up. Peter is bound by 2 chains. Now, I don't know whether these were 2 chains, like he had both chains on his arms or hands, or whether, the chains were around his hands and feet. I would imagine he had chains on his hands and chains on his feet, because it seems as though Peter is in a maximum security confinement. Okay? This is unlike the other times when Peter was locked up, where he was kind of locked up by the religious leaders who had him kind of in one room with like a guard posting at the door, that kind of thing. Now he is locked up in the king's prison, right? He has got 2 guards on either side of him while he's sleeping. I mean, he's asleep and there's 2 guards on either side of him. That's how closely he's being guarded. So he's bound hands and feet. These 2 guards are on either side of him, and then there's guards at the gate. And there's not just one set of gates. There's an inner gate and there's an outer gate. So he's behind 2 sets of gates, locked with guards posted at those gates. So this is the kind of secure area which Peter is being confined in. But I want to remind you, the church is praying, right? Church is praying. What happens when the church prays? Amazing things happen. I want you to notice Peter's escape. Let's look at verses 7 to 10. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison, and he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, "Arise quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. Then the angel said to him, "Gird yourself, tie on your sandals." And so he did. And he said to him, "Put on your garment and follow me." And so he went out and followed him, and did not know what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And when they were past the first and second guard's posts, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them of its own accord. And they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. So notice, first of all, this angel shows up, this bright light associated with the angel, which wasn't uncommon with angels, bright light showing up. But apparently no one notices this but Peter. Peter's the only one. 2 guards don't notice it. We don't even have them reference whether they were asleep or whether they were awake. But regardless of whether they're asleep, whether they're awake, they don't even notice it. We don't even have the guards referenced here. So the spotlights on, Peter there, the areas lit up and bright. The angel asks Peter 4 things. First of all, he says, get up. I like it says he strikes him. It literally, smacks him, wakes him up, get up, Peter. Time to rise up. He gets him up. He says, put on your shoes. Okay? So he gets his shoes on. He puts his sandals on. Get your clothes on. Get dressed. And then he says, follow me. So the angel leads him out, past the guards, out of the gates, out of the city, or into the, through the gates of the city, and down the road they go away from the prison. The gates of the city literally open before them automatically. It's like an automatic opening. It just opens right before them. They don't even have to touch them. It was such a strange escape that Peter doesn't even think it's real. Okay? He thinks it's all like a vision, like a dream. You ever had something happen to you so weird that you think, is this, you're wondering, is it really real? Is this real? Maybe I'm dreaming, this is actually happening. But this is the case with Peter. Then suddenly the angel's gone. He finds him standing outside the city, and he realizes, well, it is real. I'm really here. I find myself standing here in the dark all alone. And then, his instance is to go to where the church is praying for him, which we find at Mary's house. So there's this prayer meeting going on, and that's what we're going to read about in verses 11 to 17. And when Peter had come to himself, that means he had this kind of awakening, and he realizes that this wasn't a dream. He said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda answered to him. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, you are beside yourself. Yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, it is his angel. Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But motioning to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, go tell these things to James and to the brethren. And he departed and went to another place. So, here we see the church praying, and they're praying for deliverance of Peter and for God to keep him safe and do amazing, this work in his life. Interestingly enough, when Peter shows up, they're shocked that he's there. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in prison, It's sort of like the people who, pray for rain, and then they walk outside and they're shocked when it's raining, and they say, well, we didn't even bring our umbrella. Why didn't you? You're praying for rain, right? If you're praying for rain, you should expect it, bring your umbrellas, right? Be prepared, it's going to rain. So, he shows up to the house, and none of them are believing it. I can just see this little girl. She says, who is it? Obviously, this is a great time of persecution. They're not going to, it's sort of like, remember the time when Peter was hiding out in Simon the tanner's house? 2 people show up. He says, these guys start asking for him. He says, well, find out what they want. Find out find out if they, what they're looking for, because I'm a little scared to just, answer to anybody. And that's when the Lord told him, it's good you go with those guys, because I got Cornelius waiting on you and that kind of thing. So this girl's very cautious. She comes to the door and she says, who is it? It's Peter. It is Peter. She recognizes his voice. It's Peter. So she doesn't open the door. She runs back because the Bible says, Luke's writing us down, says, she's just so excited. She doesn't think to open the door. She runs back and says, hey, Peter's at the door. Peter's at the door. And you're like, no, you're crazy. You're not. You're delusional. You don't know what you're talking about. No, it is Peter. Well, you might have thought you heard something, but maybe you're just hearing like a voice of an angel, like a spirit or something, but it's not really Peter.
We got to pray for Peter.
Yeah, leave us alone. We gotta pray for Peter. We gotta pray for him. And so eventually, they keep. I guess somebody must have heard him. Heard him knocking some more. So they finally go to the door. Yeah.
Now they said, it's Peter's angel. Did they think he might have been killed?
Maybe they thought, that. And maybe they thought he was. They didn't know what happened to him. At this point. And it certainly could have thought that, and maybe that's why they were thinking it couldn't possibly be Peter. But if they're praying for him, obviously they were hoping that he was alive. I would assume that they were hoping he was alive. So they eventually open the door up to him, and he's able to share with them about his amazing delivery and how the angel brought him out and all of that. So he was able to share that testimony with them. And he asked them to tell James and the others about his deliverance and encounter with the angel. Now, if James has been killed, who's this? That was interesting, wasn't it? So this is another James. Y'all know who this James is? This is James, the half-brother of Jesus. So James, there was another James who was, born of Mary, which would have been Mary and Joseph's actual, biological son, James. That James didn't become a believer till after the resurrection of Jesus. We learn in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul eventually tells that Jesus, in a resurrected form, shows up to talk to his half-brother James and shows him his body, and after that, James becomes a believer. So James, the half-brother of Jesus, actually becomes a believer later on after the resurrection of Jesus, and now he's one of the apostles. He's one of those ones that are there preaching and proclaiming and leading in the church. So he's become a leader in the church. So Peter's encouraging now the only other James left. He said, I want you to tell James and the other brethren, about my encounter and how the Lord has brought me out. And then Luke says something kind of in passing, almost vaguely, almost just kind of like throws it out there. It says, and he went another way. He just went another way. It doesn't tell you where he went, and many scholars believe this is Luke's kind of way of saying that Peter went into hiding, that he went out to a secret location, and we don't know where Peter went, but if you read the rest of the New Testament, you get some indication he could have gone to two places. He could have gone to Antioch and hooked up with Saul there, because later on in Galatians, he has an argument where he's arguing with Saul, or then Paul, about whether they should be able to eat with Gentiles and such, and Paul didn't believe you should do that, and Peter was like, no, I learned this lesson. You can eat with Gentiles, and they argued about it. And then you read the book of Galatians, he has an argument with Paul. Paul and Peter are not getting along too good, and Paul references that kind of confrontation in the book of Galatians. And so maybe that happened. Maybe he went up to Antioch. Some people may think he went to Corinth, because we get the indication in his writing and in Peter. I think it's in the first in Corinth. And so perhaps it was one of those places, or we don't know where he went, but he definitely went, because now Agrippa is angry. Okay. So notice verses 18 and 19. It says, then as soon as it was day, so this is all happening during that night where he was locked up. Now he escaped during the night. There was no small stir among the soldiers about what had become of Peter. But when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. So, first of all, it says, I love the way Luke puts this, there was no small stir among the guards. Okay, that's putting it lightly. Because literally, here's kind of the law among guards that were in charge of prisoners as far as Rome was concerned, the Roman guard rule. If a prisoner were to escape under your watch, then that guard would be guilty of whatever the prisoner was being condemned for. Basically, you take the place of the prisoner. Peter was there to be condemned to death. Don't think for a minute that Agrippa was going to allow Peter to walk away unscathed, okay? It was going to be more than a beating. He was going to have him, he was going to assure that he was going to be put to death. But he was going to kind of make it public to the people, to the Jews, so he could get the credit for it, right? He didn't want this one to kind of get washed under the rug, sort of like with James. He wanted to make sure they saw him for the one who did it. And so these guards really knew that trouble was coming their way. If you go back and you look later on, when we're going to study Paul shipwrecked on the island, remember when they were on that boat, they're going to Rome, prisoners are on there, they shipwreck, and as they're going down, what do the guards say? Let's kill all the prisoners. Let's kill them all. Why? Because if any of them escape, we're going to die. So we might as well kill them all. How about whenever Paul and Silas are in prison? They're in the prison and they're sitting there and they, the gates, it's at midnight, they're praying. The gates come open and, the guards see the gates open and they think, oh no, they've escaped. And so what was the prisoner about to do? He was about to kill himself. He was about to take his own life. And Peter says, wait. Paul says, wait. Don't cause yourself any harm. We're all still here. We're in the prison. We're not escaped. And that was the Philippian jailer who comes to know the Lord. They're in Philippi. So, church and working in the church. But it says that Agrippa questions the guards. He examined them. That means he persecuted them. I mean, he interrogated them to the point of the word is escaping me. What is it when you're trying to question somebody and you're doing you're trying to get confession out of them? Basically, that's what they were doing. He was beating them and trying to get them to come up with this information. But they didn't know what happened. Apparently, they didn't know what happened, or otherwise they would have said anything. Agrippa was thinking, how in the world could one guy get escaped and nobody see anything? It's like he just vanishes. It kind of reminded me of that movie. One of my favorite movies is Shawshank Redemption, and where the guy escapes and the guard comes in there and the warden comes in and he says, look at the list. Look at this list. His name was checked in whenever he was here last night. And here in the morning, he's not left or gone anywhere. What happened? He just vanishes like the wind. He says, how could this happen? And this is how angry Agrippa was. And so he's searching for him. He cannot find him. Peter has disappeared and nowhere to be found. So Agrippa commands that the guards be executed, which they did. And then he travels down to Caesarea, which is down south of where Jerusalem is. It's a little bit down more south, where he is going to go, where he's actually going on a diplomatic trip. And we're going to talk about that next week as we are going to learn about kind of how God takes down Agrippa. And we'll learn more about that next week. So I want us to kind of summarize what we've learned here tonight in a couple things. First of all, we realize that the persecution hasn't gone anywhere. Though we're through 12 chapters of Acts, persecution hasn't gone anywhere. And throughout the book of Acts, we're going to constantly see there's going to be persecution. And persecution was a constant theme throughout the remainder of the book of Revelation. All except for one of the apostles were put to death. Remind you of that. All of them, except for John, who was in prison for, exiled and died in prison. So he even didn't escape persecution. And the point is, those writers of the New Testament that all experienced that persecution to death wrote with their own mouths that we would too face persecution. And we're going to face persecution today. All those who identify with Jesus Christ, who stand up for Christ, will suffer persecution. Now, sometimes that's socially. Sometimes that means that, we might be dejected socially or looked down on socially. Sometimes that is politically. We're put in a category because, you're those Christians. And so we might be, persecuted in that manner. Economically, although we haven't necessarily seen that in our country, in our time, But there are certainly Christians around this world that are experience persecution economically because they identify with Jesus. They're not given opportunities to have jobs or advancement in careers. Physically, we see that all over the world where people who identify with Jesus are physically persecuted. It's not just an ancient thing. It's happening every day and even as we speak. The Church of Christ will always be at odds in this world. Why? Because we're not of this world. The prince of the power of the air is in control of this world. One day Jesus will take it back because he holds the keys, right? And he will take back authority on this earth when he comes and puts his foot down on it. But until that day comes, we are the ones at odds with the world. So we must recognize that and realize that there will be those times of suffering. But we count it all joy, as Peter said, to suffer with Jesus because we will be glorified with him as well. But then I also love the emphasis here on prayer. Amazing things happen when God's people pray. And we know that. And so that should encourage you. But I want to look at the opposite side of that. Because something was strange about the two parties of this prayer. The one that was being prayed for and the ones that were praying. What in your minds stuck out? I have something that stuck out to me. I don't know if y'all picked up on it. But there was an element of disbelief that stuck out to me. By both of them. Peter said, it's a vision. I'm dreaming. This is not real. There's no way this is happening, right? That's what he was thinking. The people back at the house, no way. There's no way Peter's here. You know, we're praying for Peter's deliverance. No way. You're not telling the truth. Peter can't be here because he's in prison. Or he's locked up, or he's dead, or whatever. So there was this element of unbelief. And
you would have thought there would have been the one little old lady who believes in prayer.
Yeah.
And said, well, just let him in.
Yeah, go let him in. Peter, just let him in.
Right.
Yeah, the young girl believed.
But she believed because she heard.
She heard a voice. Right. Yeah, she heard his voice. But I wonder how many times we fail in our prayer because of unbelief, because we simply don't believe God. We don't trust him. We don't have faith to believe that he's going to come through for us. We might ask, but at the same time, we're not really believing that God can do this. We might ask for our loved one who's facing a difficulty physically. We might ask God to do a miracle, but we're not really believing God's going to come through. Might ask for a financial blessing, but we don't really believe that God's going to come through for that, and we worry about how we're going to make ends meet or how it's going to all turn out. And so,
I'm afraid a lot of times we teach ourselves that God isn't going to answer prayer, and it's because we don't pray in his will.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, he does answer. He's just saying no because that's not in his plan for our lives, but we want it really bad.
That's right.
Whereas
That's right.
if we were praying in his will, we would see those answers, the positive answers that we are in alignment with because we're in God's will.
Amen.
Because, the scripture is clear that, he doesn't answer your prayer this way you want because you pray amiss.
Right. And I also say, on the other side, the flip side of that coin is, God still worked. God still did it. So it tells me that it doesn't take much faith. It doesn't take much faith for God to do amazing things, right? Literally, God sent an angel who brought Peter out of a maximum security confinement. And if God would do that based upon a faith that was literally, covered in unbelief on both sides, and if God could still work, then we can have faith that we should never give up. We should never give up, hold on to faith. And I always tell people, be specific. Pray specifically. Because when you pray specifically, then when God does it, there's no doubt that God did it. Okay? When God does exactly what you ask for, you can say, without a doubt, I give God the praise. But don't be shocked when God does come through. And God does do exactly what you asked him to do. Not always, like Michael said, not always will he do exactly what you ask, but that's always been my go-to, and I always try to do that is because it certainly has worked, and
Yeah.
and it works. It never hurts to pray.
Another interesting point that you mentioned tonight, it's not in this passage, but something else that hasn't changed in the church is there are going to be, we will have disagreements
Mm-hmm.
that aren't doctrine. Some of
Yeah.
the things that you and I
Yeah,
have talked
yeah,
about today,
yeah,
we'll have things that aren't doctrine that we're not going to agree on.
right.
And
Yeah.
they,
Yeah,
there are plenty of those guys in the Bible that differed on.
yeah,
What we consider simple today is, all right, I don't think I should eat Chick-fil-A or, McDonald's or whatever,
We've already seen in our brief study of Acts so far, we've already seen Peter and Barnabas not agreeing on stuff. We've seen Ananias and Peter not agreeing on stuff. We've seen Saul, well, we will see Saul or Paul not agreeing with Peter on stuff. So there's a lot of disagreements about stuff. Peter, remember most of the apostles in a group not agreeing with Peter over stuff. They didn't agree with one another over stuff and judging him over things. So there's a lot of disagreements, but at the same time, doesn't mean that we're not all heading in the same direction as far as our faith. Sometimes we just don't all have it figured out. And I always say, the Lord will straighten us all up when we get up there. He'll straighten us up. I think that's what He's going to do for the first so many years. First so many years. If I'm pre-tribulational, that means we got 7 years for the Lord to straighten us all up, right? Because it's at the end of the 7-year tribulation where we had the marriage supper of the Lamb before we come back for the 1,000-year millennial reign. So we got 7 years for the Lord to straighten us all up.
We're going to all reign the same way?
He's got to get us on the same page. And he pretty much took care of the world in 7 days, so he can straighten up the church in that period too. So.
And having the mind of God is going to help.
Yeah, that'll help us not disagree so bad, right? We won't argue with the Lord once He says stuff. Hopefully not, anyway.
Well, I think my children still will.
I think there's a lot of people who probably believe they would still argue with the Lord, but we'll see.
You mentioned it's not really persecution in this moment, but it's very interesting. Tammy had mentioned something the other night, and I've heard a couple of YouTube videos on it on the same topic recently, was how people relate the idea of being pro-life to being a Christian belief.
Right.
The belief in not killing babies is somehow a Christian belief. I saw a guy doing a YouTube video that I'm not even sure he would consider himself a Christian, but he was drawing that parallel. Why is that a Christian belief? Of not killing babies.
Yeah.
How's that a Christian belief?
Yeah. It was interesting. We actually started talking about abortion in our men's meeting the other night. That was the topic. It was looking at it from the biblical perspective, and Chip was taking us through all the way back to the where it came from and how it all started. And it was interesting to kind of see how it came about and the different eras of time where it was like prominent. And
Candace Owens had a video just the other day. She was unhappy with what one of the popular singer people had said, and she went back to the history of the Planned Parenthood organization, how that was started as a way to get rid of certain races of people.
Right.
Why when you look at where the facilities were placed, it was the person that started their original plan was to reduce the black population, some other Middle East or whoever that came over and all that.
Yeah.
That was whole plan for it.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. It wouldn't surprise me none. All right. Well, we're going to go to our prayer time now, and appreciate everybody maybe joined us online, and we appreciate you stopping tonight and taking time to join our Bible study. I want to encourage you to continue. If you have any prayer requests you'd like us to pray for, please leave them either on our website or in the comment section below the video, and we'll be praying for you, and we will continue to lift you up throughout this week. I hope God blesses you with the remainder of your week, and stay well out there, stay dry, and stay safe. God bless.